Shalom, Erev Tov, good evening from Jerusalem, Israel. This is Mr. Lowell Joseph Gallen, founder of the Root and Branch Association Limited. Welcome to episode 23 of our weekly Root and Branch Association Medical War Crimes Seminars, hosted by Rabbi Hanania Weitzman, in my opinion, the Rabbi Dov Ber Chaim Weissmandel of our time, and his guest, who will join in a few minutes, Mr. Shuey Finkelstein, who's going to update us on following the money. Where's the money coming from and going to? And it ain't pretty. And in my opinion, a modern Maccabee, as are all those participating in this session. Having said that, Hanani, it's all yours. Please continue.
All right, thank you very much, Lowell. Welcome to the program, everybody. Tonight, we're going to continue for the first 20 minutes or so on the Walder scandal. There's a lot of new information. Last week, we talked about the Chavetz Chaim and the laws of slandering people and how none of the other pseudo/quasi-rabbis talking about this are even bringing up the Chavetz Chaim. And if they are, they're not bringing actual sources. There was actually a video that came out today with a certain rabbi whose name I won't mention, who said that according to the Chavetz Chaim, if rumors are going around about somebody for a day and a half, then you are allowed to publicly slander him. So I posted a comment to his video asking, well, what if somebody anonymously says rumors about you for a day and a half? What would the Jewish law be? I'm waiting for an answer on that. He did not quote an actual source from the Chavetz Chaim. It's just somewhere floating around in the ether of the Chavetz Chaim that law seems to exist. I would love for him to show that to us. Anyway, the first link, I posted 4 links in the chat box, and they'll be posted on the recording as well. The first link is an update to an article I wrote about the Walder scandal. And yesterday I added a source from the Yad Ephraim and the laws of Shechita at the very beginning, because I quote my actual sources because I want people to look them up. And he tells a very fascinating story. In a certain city, he says, there were 2 different Jewish communities. One of them was a group of Romanian Jews, and after that, a group of Sephardim settled in that area. And there was one shochet that was being shared by both of these Jewish groups. The shochet was apparently giving more attention to the first group of Jews who lived there, the Romanians, and therefore the Sephardim hated him, he writes, and they were plotting against him to have him fired from his job. They wanted to get a different shochet. And as part of their little plot, they tried to produce or manufacture witnesses in such a way that the shochet would be disqualified and run out of town. Okay, so they made a witch hunt against this shochet, and they summoned him to come to their court to be examined and questioned, and the shochet refused to come to the court because there was no one there from the Romanian men participating in this court, and he knew that they were out to get him, and he knew that this whole court proceeding was a farce. So therefore, since the shochet did not show up to the court, the judges or quasi-judges that they established accepted testimony in his absence and then punished him with fasting. The language is a little bit unclear. It says they struck him, which could either mean they punished him that he should be liable for lashes as well, or that they struck him that he would be liable to pay monetary damages and fines. That's definitely the case. I'm just unsure if they said that he's also liable for lashes. But they definitely said that this shochet is guilty and liable for fasting as part of tshuva. He has to pay monetary damages and also fines. In spite of all this, writes the Yad Ephraim, quoting a tshuva from the Mayim Amukim, in spite of all this, he says the shochet was not disqualified with this testimony because it was not done in his presence. And then he writes, well, what about the fact that they summoned him and he didn't go? He says the shochet acted properly because he knew that they were just searching for a pretext to disqualify him and they would not see any merit in his favor. So since he knew that the trial was a farce, he had every right and privilege to not show up for it. He says, furthermore, since it was well known and all the Romanian men were testifying that the Sephardim were simply going after him because he didn't give them as much attention, and they were willing to spend money to hire false witnesses and run a false trial against him in order to get rid of him and appoint someone else in his place. Therefore, both the judges and the witnesses clearly had a vested interest. They had some kind of an axe to grind, and they were invalid. Very interesting tshuva from the Yad Ephraim, again, in the very beginning of the laws of Shechita. Very similar to the case of Walder. I mean, one of the major, what they're calling proofs of his guilt, or they're justifying themselves in finding him guilty and slandering him far and wide, is the fact that he didn't show up for the court when he was summoned. Well, he had every right not to show up because, again, Shmuel Eliyahu declared his guilt or assumed his guilt before even hearing testimony or starting the court proceedings. It was clearly a witch hunt against him. There's no doubt about that. They were not going to see any merits in his favor. Therefore, he had every right, according to Jewish law, to not show up for such a trial. He was proper in doing so. And the fact that he didn't show up for such a court is no proof of his guilt and certainly no reason to slander him. Okay, that was in the article. I posted that. That is in link number 1. Moving ahead, I want to talk about some of the responses of rabbis to this who are sort of sticking up for their colleagues. And they're playing a little game. They do the same thing with the COVID and the shots when they're trying to sort of prove from the Torah that everybody should take the shots and follow the health ministry and all that stuff. So they say COVID is really, really bad and COVID is deadly and saving lives is very good. And the Torah commands us to save lives. Therefore, you've got to take the shots. Now, the dots don't necessarily connect, but that's the premise that they're working with. COVID is bad, saving lives is good. Therefore, ... follow all of the instructions. They do the same thing in the case of Walder. Abusers are very bad. Protecting victims is very good. Therefore, ... anything goes. Now, that is a house of cards. Again, the dots do not connect. I mean, everybody agrees that abusers are bad and protecting victims is good, but that doesn't mean that the Torah is really on their side. So a rabbi by the name of Abraham Neuberger published a what he calls a note on Hilchos Lashon Hara in a recent issue of Mishpacha magazine. That is link number 2. You can find it online. And he is associated with the Chaim Heritage Foundation, so you would think that he is an expert on the laws of Lashon Hara. And he writes as follows in a parenthetical comment. You would think that this should be like the real crux of everything. He writes in a parenthetical comment as follows. The halachic grounds for based in accepting testimony in the absence of the accused and for minors and others who are generally not accepted for testimony is discussed in the poskim. See Choshen Mishpat 33 and is beyond the scope of this brief note. Well, that is the crux of this brief note. I mean, you're saying that you can accept testimony in the absence of the accused and from minors and others in a way that testimony is normally not accepted. I want to see some real hardcore sources over here. The only thing he mentions is a Rema in Choshen Mishpat 33, chapter 33. He doesn't even tell us what section of chapter 33. That would be very convenient if he did so. So I looked up the entire Choshen Mishpat chapter 33 and looked at all the Remas over there. And the only one that is even remotely connected to this topic is in letter 15. And there he writes clearly, it's actually coming from the Shach. The Rama talks about cases of murder. If somebody gravely injures somebody and a person is dying, can the dying person testify against the person who essentially has murdered him? He talks about cases like that, or the family of the murder victim. He talks about that. He doesn't talk about accepting testimony from people who are not present in the court. He doesn't talk about minors. Nothing there. The Shach actually on 33:15 in Choshen Mishpat writes at great length, and he says, in fact, you are not allowed to accept testimony in absence of the person who is being accused, even in monetary cases. He says, certainly, it goes without saying, in capital cases, as it would be in cases of abuse, things like that, murder, all of those cases, you certainly cannot accept testimony in absence of the person there. Okay, Rabbi Neuberger further writes, and I'm quoting, once Basin determines that there are grounds for the accusation, then whether it is Lashon Hara for them to publicize their findings depends on a single factor, to'eles/constructive benefit. We talked about this last week. And he continues, lastly, the prohibition against speaking Lashon Hara about a dead person applies due to a cherem. This cherem, however, does not apply to a rodef. Now, we talked about this cherem last week, and the Chavetz Chaim, if you look it up, gave you the source last week, does not have any qualifications about not speaking Lashon Hara about a dead person who's a murderer. Now, a rodef, by definition, is somebody who's chasing after somebody to kill them or rape them. Literally, rodef means chasing. So if somebody's holding a sword and chasing after somebody saying, I'm going to kill you, that is a rodef, and you would be allowed to speak slanderously about that person, obviously hoping to save his potential victim's life. But once a person is dead, he by definition cannot be a rodef. He's not chasing anybody. Maybe in the past he was a murderer, but now he is dead. He's not a rodef. He's not chasing anybody. So how could it be that the cherem against speaking about dead people does not apply to a rodef when it is impossible for a dead person to be a rodef? So I sent an email to Rabbi Neuberger, very, very politely, asking him, A, for his source in Choshen Mishpat. I said, can you please be more specific about your source where it states that you are allowed to accept testimony in the absence of the accused? And what is your source that the cherem of speaking Lashon Hara against dead people does not apply to a rodef, being that a rodef by definition cannot be dead? So he emailed me back saying that he will try to get back to me later in the week. That was 2 days ago. Now, you would think he would have these sources on his fingertips. He wrote this article, and he should be able to find the sources very quickly. He better start looking because there are no such sources. Unfortunately, if he gives me a response with anything interesting, I'll be happy to update you. But unfortunately, Rabbi Neuberger published a nothing burger. There's nothing there. His source in the Choshen Mishpat chapter 33, saying that you can accept testimony in absence of the accused, does not exist. And in fact, if you look over there, it's contrary to what he claims. And the source that the cherem of speaking against dead people does not apply to Rodate is preposterous. Go to link number 3. This is where it gets really fun. Shmuel Eliyahu on December 26th published a long Facebook post explaining the actions of his court against Chaim Walder. Why Eliyahu spends so much time, a gadol hadar like him is spending so much time on Facebook, it's a separate question. That is link number 3 for the original Hebrew. And link number 4, you can see a translation in a Jewish press article. They translated to English, and they also talk about that. We'll talk about the Jewish press a little bit later. I'm going to quote to you in the Hebrew from Eliyahu's Facebook post as follows. The Jewish law obligates us as rabbis to act against men who are defiling Jewish homes. And as support for this, I mean, we don't really need support for that, but he does us the favor of giving us 3 sources in support of that. Gemara and Tainus, Yud Beis Amud Aleph, Moed Katan, Vav Amud Aleph, and the Beis Yosef, Tuf Kuf Samach Hey. Okay? And now I looked up all 3 sources. He's probably assuming that nobody will look up the sources, and if they will, they probably won't understand the sources. I looked them up, and by the way, I was assisted in doing research for this tonight. I just want to give a thank you, a public thank you to Abba Horowitz, who was a previous guest on the program, a big Torah scholar. Anyway, I looked up Tainus Yud Beis and Moed Katan Vav, and it doesn't talk about rabbis acting against people who defile the Jewish homes. It actually talks about fasting, fast days, and the prayers on public fast days. Absolutely nothing to do with what Eliyahu was even talking about. The Beis Yosef as well, talking about public prayers on fast days and how we do all that. Okay, so again, he's just making things up out of thin air. Unbelievable. I wonder how he's judging cases. Maybe the testimony is made up out of thin air too, because his Torah sources are. And he continues in his Facebook post. The court proceedings in such cases do not have to follow the normal court procedures, and we do not have to accept testimony in his presence. Certainly, when this person is known, frequently threatens women, and they are afraid of him. So it might be a danger for the women to testify. They might be intimidated. So Eliyahu writes in his Facebook post, and therefore we are not necessarily obligated to receive testimony in his presence. And here, conveniently, he quotes another source for this, the Rama in Choshen Mishpat, Siman Chavches Seif Tesvav. So I looked this up as well. I did a little homework. Choshen Mishpat 28:15. And interestingly enough, it says as follows. Ein mekablan eidos shelo b'fnei baldin v'im kiblu ein danin al piv. We do not receive testimony in absence of the litigants, and if we do not judge based on that testimony. So Eliyahu is not off to a good start with this one. It's saying the exact opposite of what he claims. Okay, the source continues, skipping a little further, which is not relevant. We're getting to the relevant stuff. Ima baldin hu elaim. Let's say the baldin, the litigant, is a gangster, a real tough guy. And the witnesses are afraid to speak before him. Then we do, in such cases, we receive testimony not in his presence, and we judge according to that. Mihu, however, if we are able to force the gangster to behave properly and listen to the judgment, okay, Kederach as far as was explained earlier, he says, Yesh omrim de lo amru ein mekablan edas elf nei baldin. Okay, so then we don't do that, and he continues and writes, so if Walder theoretically, let's say he was a gangster and he was going to murder these women, it so happens the only person he threatened, according to the claims, was himself. They're claiming that he threatened the women, that if they proceed with the testimony, he's going to kill himself. He wasn't threatening them. And anyway, it doesn't seem that they made any effort to force him to go to court. They just basically invited him, or they summoned him, and they tried to speak to him privately, and then they just went full blast against him. So they violated this. He continues, Yesh Omrim, further he writes, when do we say that we do not receive testimony except in the presence of the litigants? He must be there. That's only in monetary cases. But if people are simply arguing with one another. They're arguing, they're fighting. Where we have a concern that if the witnesses testify in their presence, they're just going to continue to argue with each other. It's just going to add fuel to the fire. They're going to be screaming in the court. It's going to be crazy. They're going to shout at the witnesses and shout at each other. It'll be a whole balagan. Okay, tiknu hagaonim. So the geonim made a takana. They made a law. In such cases, we can receive testimony not in the presence of the litigants. Gamlo yiglu mihem oedim. They would also not reveal who the witnesses are. The Ramah continues. To me, it seems that davka kishena basin rotzim ladon echad mehem al pihadin belanosh. It seems to me that this only applies, even this limited circumstance where you can receive testimony in absence of the litigants, would only be when the court doesn't actually intend to punish anybody. Rakla hashkit hakitada, just to quiet the argument, meaning you have two old grumps in shul and they've been fighting for the last 40 years and they're pointing fingers and they want to settle. They want to have shalom bayis already. So they each have witnesses for the story, and these people are yelling at each other for 40 years. So we can't have the witnesses talk and give the testimony in their presence in the courts. If Basin simply wants to settle an argument and stop people from fighting, then they can have witnesses testify in their absence and not even reveal who the witnesses are. Okay, only in them. But if Basin wants to actually take action against somebody and punish them, okay, then they cannot receive testimony not in their presence. This Basin, of course, intended to punish Walder in various ways. So there is no heter whatsoever. Again, I'm looking up Eliyahu's own source. He says, this is my source for receiving testimony in absence of the litigant. That source actually says the exact opposite. So Eliyahu has a consistent track record here of either making up sources that don't exist or quoting sources that say the exact opposite of what he wants you to believe. Now, at the end of this source, the Ramah gives reference to Even Ezer, Siman 11, Law 4. So I looked that one up as well, just for fun. And I found even more interesting information. This is actual Torah. Yesh Omrim, he says. Some say, Shimbo Edom She'eshes Ish Zinsa, Tzricha Drisha V'Chakira, that if witnesses come that a married woman had immoral relations with somebody, then the court needs to investigate it properly as they would with any murder trial, meaning really to cross-examine all the witnesses and go over the testimony very well. However, the court must not receive the witnesses outside of her presence and the presence of her husband. Okay, once again, the litigants must be there. They are claiming that Walder had relations with married women. Okay, the married women and the husband and Walder all must be in the court, and that was not the case. Okay, I also looked up the tshuva of the Rush, which is cited at the end of this teaching. Again, you just follow the trail of Torah. One source leads to the next one, and this is a tshuva of the Rush, Klal Mem Vav. That's Rule 46, Siman Aleph, the very first note he writes. I'm just going to quote part of it. He is referencing a trial about a woman, about a wife cheating on her husband. And he says this testimony must only be accepted by expert judges doing very thorough cross-examination in order not to forbid a woman to her husband, because if a woman has sensual relations, and she is permanently forbidden to her husband. So before the court is going to accept this testimony, they better make darn sure that it's true. Okay. Furthermore, he writes, in this particular case that he's writing about, lesser isha al bala, to forbid a wife to her husband. Hakol modim, everybody agrees that you have to investigate it very thoroughly with all kinds of questions, and to accept the witnesses in the presence of the litigants, with Negedoli Israel, and before the greatest of the judges in Israel, that they know how to investigate things very well, and not to hide in the darkness, have seek secret trials, and to spread rumors and scandal about a woman who is living with her husband. You can't do that. And even in monetary cases, we must not receive testimony in the absence of the litigants. Because of Rabbeinu Yitzchak bar Asher Halevi Zal, he writes, that if the court receives testimony in absence of the litigant, Eino edus ladan al piv. As we saw earlier, he writes again, this is not a valid testimony, and you cannot rule according to it. And he concludes, skipping a little further, V'roi lahanish l'chol mi shahaya ba'osa etza ba'osa vada kabel edus shalaz gam alisha. It is appropriate to punish anybody who is part of this plot and any part of this group of rabbis to accept testimony, scandalous testimony that damages the reputation of a woman who is living with her husband outside of her presence. In other words, anybody who runs a trial the way Eliyahu and his colleagues did should be punished. Okay, that is what the Rush writes. Back to Erev Rav Eliyahu's Facebook post. This gets even better. Can't imagine this. So he says that Walder was destroying Jewish homes. He was an obstacle and he was defiling Jewish homes. Walder continued on his way without stopping a single moment. 24/7, Walder was defiling and destroying Jewish homes. I wonder when he had time to write his books. And then he writes as follows. Listen to this. Kibalnu edius al 22 nashim v'naros shupagabayim. We received testimony about 22 women and young girls that he injured, damaged. And there is no doubt whatsoever that these incidents are only a small portion of his evil deeds. Now, how could he possibly know that it's only a small portion? Because Eliyahu is a Navi, of course. He's a prophet and he knows everything. But if you're looking at the words very carefully, and if you look at the Jewish Press translation, it says the same. Kibalnu edus al 22 nashim. We received testimony about 22 women. Now, that's not what the media is telling us and what all these social media, social justice warriors are claiming, that he received testimony from 22 alleged victims. He said we received testimony about 22 women. In other words, Eliyahu and his kangaroo court didn't hear from 22 victims. I'm willing to bet they didn't hear from any victims at all. They got a couple. If this court proceeding even happened, and at this point, how do we even know that it did? If it happened, who was there? Other people saying slander about Walder, that he did this and he did that. 22 such stories. It was all hearsay. They didn't hear from any victims. The victims' husbands weren't there. Walder wasn't there. And the women themselves, the victims themselves, were not there. He heard about the victims. It's kind of like how people didn't really die from COVID, but they died with COVID. There's a little trace of COVID somewhere in the system. Same thing here. He didn't hear from 22 women. He heard about 22 women. He heard 22 stories. Notice in the Jewish Press, in link number 4, in the very same article where they have Eliyahu's post, they write as follows. The rabbis ruled him guilty following evidence from 22 victims. Imagine such fake news, how the media is a total joke. The Jewish Press, in the same article where they have a translation of Eliyahu's post, and they translate it correctly, that he heard about 22 victims. In their summary, in the beginning of the article, they write he was ruled guilty following evidence from 22 victims. False, total fake news. No victims testified whatsoever. So Eliyahu and his company are either woefully ignorant or criminally corrupt, or both. I'm betting on both. They should be made to stand before a basin and account for their actions. And according to the Rush, they should be punished. Okay. Now, we were told that it had to be a secret trial, contrary to halacha, because it's too painful for the victims to testify. But the victims themselves didn't testify. Again, they only heard about the victims. So if that's the case, who are the witnesses? Who were the witnesses? We should be able to know who the witnesses were telling stories. It wasn't painful for them just to tell stories. Why can't we know who they are and how they got their information? Why is that not being revealed to us? Where are the husbands, right? If Walder was destroying all these Jewish homes, where are the husbands that are protesting against him and testifying against him because they too were victimized by this? How come none of the husbands have stepped forward? Okay, Eliyahu and his cohorts are clearly megalapanim b'Torah shelo k'halacha. They're making up Torah, trampling all over Jewish law, and they have literally caused people to die. Those who say we cannot speak badly of Talmidei Chachamim, there's a very simple answer to that. When the Talmidei Chachamim are wicked, corrupt people who trample on halacha, disgrace the Torah and the Jewish people, destroy people's lives, literally make up Torah stories to defend their actions, we are obligated to speak against them. These Talmidei Chachamim are not Talmidei Chachamim. They are frauds. They are weasels. They are shams. And we have to boot them out of the community. And because we stand with the victims of these people. Further questions about this, and then we will conclude. Where did Walder get the gun? They claim that Walder killed himself with the gun by his son's grave. Where did he get the gun? It's not so easy to get a gun legally in Israel. If you're a settler, maybe, but it's not so easy to get a gun. And if he made up his mind he wanted to kill himself, I would think it's a very troublesome way to kill yourself by illegally trying to get a gun. There's a lot of more convenient ways to do it. So why isn't anybody asking these questions? Because the media doesn't function anymore. The media just prints whatever the government and their cohorts tell them to print. They don't ask questions that everybody should be asking. Furthermore, they claim that Walder was found dead in Segula Cemetery in Petach Tikva. I looked it up on Google. Google Images, you can do the same, and you will see not at all a surprise that there are cameras everywhere, because Israel is a surveillance state like China. There's cameras everywhere, certainly in the cemetery. Where is the surveillance footage of Walder going to the cemetery alone, taking out a gun and blowing his brains out? Okay, there are more holes in this story than Swiss cheese. If we had a functioning media, they would be asking these questions and not playing defense for the cover story. Okay, I strongly believe, based on all this, that Walder was whacked. Okay, apparently he fell out of favor with the mafia crime family that runs Israel, and they had him whacked. And Shmuel Eliyahu has been involved in scandalous phony court proceedings in the past. Look him up; you'll find many such instances of this. And he seems to be a assassin for the government to destroy people's character, and then they finish the job. So people say that you can't ask questions. Don't, because if you ask questions and you're not standing with the victims, anybody who plays the standing with the victims card can stuff it, because there are real victims over here, and we all need to know where and when did this trial take place, who testified, what was the testimony, where did they get their information, how were they cross-examined. So I'd like everybody has a role to play here. Call up Shmuel Eliyahu if you live in Sfat, or he's going to one of these, he's giving a shiur somewhere. I'd like you to take out your phone camera and record yourself asking him some of these questions, put him on the spot, okay? Hold these people accountable. We have to demand answers. Do not be intimidated by their regal appearance and their long beards and their fake smiles. These people are weasels, and they are Erev Rav, and they have to answer questions. Anybody can ask me questions. I'm putting my real name and my real face out there. I'm saying some very tough things. And people can question me, and people can challenge me, and people can ask me for my sources. And if they do so respectfully, I'll be happy to engage them. And even if they're not so respectful, I'll still answer them, okay? Because that's what a real rabbi and every human being should do. If people are asking you for your sources and to back up what you're saying, you better be ready to do it. And these rabbis who are fake rabbis, they can't hide behind their greatness. They can't behind their last name that they have from their father. They can't behind their titles or the government, or they're being too busy. If they are destroying people's lives and making up Torah sources, they have to answer for this.